The first time I realized my life had already changed, I was standing in the hallway between our bedroom and the kitchen, holding a question I didn't yet know how to ask. I tell myself that memory is unreliable, that it reshapes itself around whatever meaning we need to survive, but some moments refuse to blur. That hallway still feels narrow in my mind, the light too bright for the hour, the floor cool through my socks. I remember thinking, absurdly, that the house felt like it was listening. That it knew something about me before I did. I had trusted my wife with everything that mattered: finances, grief, ambition, the quiet fears men are taught to disguise as competence. I trusted her with the version of myself I thought was complete. What I didn't know then was that trust, real trust, has a way of excavating what you've buried, not because it wants to hurt you, but because it can't stand the lie of an unfinished truth. I was raised to believe that identity was a solid thing. You chose it early, refined it over time, and defended it when questioned. My father spoke about manhood the way some people talk about gravity: invisible, unquestionable, and unforgiving if you ignored it. You stood straight. You provided. You did not indulge confusion. I learned those rules well enough to pass them on to myself without ever needing him in the room. So when I married Claire, I believed I was bringing her a finished product. A husband. A future. Someone stable. If there were flickers of uncertainty in me, and there were, they stayed nameless, safely tucked behind jokes, work, and the busy righteousness of being useful. Claire had always been attentive in a way that felt generous rather than invasive. She noticed shifts in mood, the way a musician notices a string slightly out of tune. Early in our marriage, she asked me once why I went quiet around mirrors. I laughed it off. Said I was tired. She didn't press, but she remembered. She always remembered. The night everything began, or at least the night I stopped pretending it hadn't already begun, started without ceremony. We were folding laundry, an ordinary domestic rhythm, our hands moving with the familiarity of a long-practiced dance. She held up one of her sweaters, a soft, unremarkable thing, and asked if I thought it had shrunk. I don't know, I said. It looks the same. She smiled, but there was a pause afterward, a space where she might have said nothing and let the moment pass. Instead, she asked, gently, "Can I ask you something without you trying to fix it?" That sentence should have warned me. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was careful. Claire only spoke that way when something mattered. Okay, I said, feeling a subtle tightening in my chest. Do you ever feel like you're performing yourself? The question landed with a weight I wasn't prepared for. Not because it was accusatory, it wasn't, but because it named something I had never admitted out loud, not even to myself. I stared at the towel in my hands, suddenly unsure how long I'd been holding it. I don't know what you mean, I said, and hated how quickly the words came. She nodded. You don't have to answer now. We finished folding in silence. Later, in bed, she fell asleep with the ease of someone who trusts the ground beneath her. I lay awake, replaying the question until it began to feel like a mirror I could no longer avoid. Performing yourself. I had always thought of my life as authentic because it was consistent. I worked hard. I loved my wife. I didn't cheat or disappear or break promises. But authenticity, I was beginning to understand, isn't only about what you do. It's about what you allow yourself to notice. There were moments from my past that returned that night with unsettling clarity. The way I'd lingered in clothing stores longer than necessary, drawn not by desire but by curiosity I couldn't articulate. The quiet relief I felt when expectations fell away, when I was sick, or alone, or otherwise exempt from being seen. The strange calm that came from imagining myself differently, not in a dramatic way, but as if adjusting a lens until the image finally sharpened. None of these moments had ever felt sexual or scandalous. That was part of why I'd dismissed them. They felt emotional, internal, almost philosophical. And because I lacked a framework for them, I'd assumed they meant nothing. The next morning, Claire poured coffee and slid a mug toward me without comment. Sunlight cut across the table, illuminating dust in the air. Ordinary, again. Safe. I was thinking about what you asked, I said, surprising both of us. She looked up, attentive but calm. You don't have to. I think I've been trying to be very good at being who I'm supposed to be, I said. And I don't know how to tell if that's the same as being honest. She didn't rush to reassure me. That was another thing I loved about her. She let silence do its work. Honest with whom? She asked. The answer rose before I could stop it. Myself. That was the first crack. Not dramatic. Not revelatory. Just enough to let light in. Over the following weeks, our conversations shifted. They didn't become constant or intense, but they grew more precise. Claire asked questions that didn't push, only invited. I found myself responding in ways that surprised me, less defensively, more tentatively. As if I were learning a new language with no guarantee I'd ever be fluent. One evening, she said, "You know, curiosity isn't betrayal." I laughed, but it caught in my throat. Curiosity about what? About yourself, she said. About the parts you never got permission to explore. Permission. The word echoed. I had spent my life waiting for it without realizing that was what I was doing. The first experiment was almost laughably small. Claire suggested, offhandedly, that we switch sides of the closet. Just to see, she said. No meaning attached. Standing there later, alone, I felt ridiculous. As if the walls might accuse me. I touched the fabric of one of her shirts, nothing special, just cotton, and felt a strange mix of resistance and relief. The sensation wasn't pleasure. It was recognition. I didn't put anything on that night. I wasn't ready. But something had shifted. The possibility itself had entered the room. What unsettled me most wasn't fear of discovery or judgment. It was the moral weight of the question forming quietly beneath everything else. If this was true, even partially, what did I owe the people who loved me? What did honesty require, and what would it cost? I had always believed integrity meant consistency. I was starting to suspect it might mean courage instead. I didn't yet know where this path would lead, or how profoundly it would reshape my understanding of gender, trust, and responsibility. I only knew that the man I had been pretending was complete had begun to listen, to his wife, to himself, to a truth that was patient enough to wait decades to be heard. And once you hear something like that, you don't get to pretend you didn't. The first rule I made for myself was that nothing would happen without consent, mine and hers. That rule mattered more than I understood at the time. It anchored me when everything else felt strangely fluid. Curiosity, once acknowledged, doesn't stay politely in its corner. It expands, not aggressively, but persistently, like water finding the lowest point. I began noticing how often my thoughts returned to questions of presentation, not in the mirror-checking way I'd once associated with vanity, but as a kind of quiet audit. How am I being read right now? What assumptions are being made about me, and which of them am I actively reinforcing? These questions weren't new. What was new was that I wasn't immediately ashamed of them. Claire never framed what we were doing as exploration, in the grand sense. She framed it as listening. That distinction mattered. Exploration implies destination. Listening implies patience. One evening, after dinner, she said, "If you ever want to try something, clothes, pronouns, anything, you can. You don't owe me an explanation first." The offer landed gently, but its implications were enormous. I nodded, thanked her, and promptly did nothing for days. Permission, I was learning, doesn't automatically dissolve fear. Sometimes it makes it louder. When I finally did try something, it was almost comically restrained. A cardigan of hers, worn late at night, the house dark and quiet. I remember standing in the bathroom, cardigan on, staring not at my reflection but at my hands. They looked the same. Capable. Familiar. The world hadn't ended. No alarms. No sudden revelation. What surprised me most was the absence of excitement. Instead, there was a kind of stillness, like a held breath finally released. I felt less like I was becoming someone else and more like I had stopped bracing. That distinction would become important later, when I had to explain, first to myself, then to others, that this wasn't about transformation as escape. It was about alignment. The days that followed were marked by small, almost imperceptible changes. I spoke more slowly. I listened more. At work, I noticed how often I defaulted to certainty even when uncertainty would have been more honest. I began choosing my words with greater care, not out of fear, but out of respect, for myself and for the people around me. Claire noticed, of course. She always did. "You seem softer," she said one morning, not as praise, not as concern. Just observation. "I feel less armored," I replied, and meant it. Armor is useful. It protects. But it also distances. I had worn it so long I'd mistaken its weight for strength. We talked, often, about what this did and did not mean. Claire was careful not to project a narrative onto me. She didn't suggest labels or outcomes. When I faltered into self-accusation, worrying aloud that I was misleading her, that I was changing the terms of our marriage, she listened without dismissing the fear, but she didn't indulge it either. "Growth isn't deception," she said once. "Deception is refusing to look." That sentence stayed with me. Still, moral questions surfaced relentlessly. What responsibilities did I have to the image of myself that others depended on? My parents, who spoke with pride about their son. Colleagues who read my confidence as stability. Friends who'd known me for decades without suspecting the quiet complexity beneath the surface. I wasn't naive. I knew that visibility carries consequence. I also knew that invisibility carries cost. For a long time, my compromise was privacy. What happened at home stayed at home. This felt responsible, even generous. I wasn't asking anyone else to adjust. I wasn't demanding recognition. I told myself that was maturity. But privacy has a way of becoming partition, and partition, if left unexamined, becomes fracture. The first time I went outside wearing something that might be read as feminine, it was by accident, or at least that's how it felt. A scarf, borrowed from Claire, wrapped loosely around my neck. It was cold, and I hadn't thought much about it until I caught my reflection in a shop window. The image startled me, not because it looked wrong, but because it looked possible. No one stared. No one commented. The world absorbed the image and moved on. I stood there longer than necessary, heart pounding, aware that this moment mattered far more to me than it did to anyone else. That realization was both comforting and destabilizing. If the stakes were internal, then so was the responsibility. That night, I told Claire what had happened, how ordinary it had been. She smiled. Sometimes the world is less invested in our fear than we are. Not always, I knew. But sometimes. As weeks turned into months, the internal shifts deepened. I found myself reevaluating not just gender, but the broader architecture of my values. Why had I equated restraint with virtue? Why had emotional fluency felt optional rather than essential? How many judgments, about myself and others, had I accepted without interrogation? This wasn't a dismantling. It was a renovation. Messy, slower than I wanted, but purposeful. I also began to feel grief. That surprised me. Grief for the years spent narrowing myself to fit expectations I'd never consciously agreed to. Grief for the ease with which I dismissed other people's expressions as a not for me, mistaking disinterest for understanding. With grief came empathy. Not the abstract kind, but the kind that changes behavior. I listened differently when friends talked about feeling unseen. I noticed how often conversations defaulted to binaries, strong or weak, masculine or feminine, normal or other, and how little room those binaries left for honesty. I didn't correct people. Not yet. But I noticed. The tension between secrecy and integrity came to a head during a visit from my parents. Nothing dramatic happened. No confrontation. That was the problem. My mother commented on how well Claire and I seemed to be doing. My father joked about my job, my responsibilities, my good head on my shoulders. I smiled, nodded, played my part with practiced ease. That night, lying awake in my childhood bedroom, I felt the weight of omission settle heavy in my chest. I wasn't lying. But I wasn't telling the truth either. The next morning, I stood in the bathroom, looking at myself in the mirror. Not searching for femininity or masculinity. Just presence. I asked myself a question I'd been avoiding: was I protecting others from discomfort, or protecting myself from accountability? The answer wasn't flattering. When I returned home, I told Claire how unsettled I felt. She listened, then said something that shifted the ground beneath me. "You don't owe everyone everything," she said. "But you do owe yourself coherence." Coherence. Not disclosure. Not performance. Alignment between inner life and outer action, at a pace that honored both truth and consequence. That became my new metric. I began small. Correcting assumptions gently when they arose. Allowing softness in public spaces without explanation. Letting myself be read ambiguously and resisting the urge to clarify for others' comfort. Each choice carried risk. Each also carried relief. What I was becoming, what I was allowing myself to be, was not a rejection of my past, but a more honest continuation of it. I was still married. Still responsible. Still accountable. But I was no longer pretending that identity was a single note played forever without variation. The most profound transformation wasn't visible. It was ethical. I was learning that integrity isn't about maintaining an image. It's about responding truthfully to what you discover, even when discovery arrives late. I didn't yet call myself her girl. That language would come later, layered with meaning and negotiation. But something in me had already shifted from defense to openness, from certainty to curiosity. And once that shift happens, you can't reverse it without doing harm to yourself and to the people who love you enough to notice. The danger of gradual change is that you don't always recognize its gravity until you look back and realize how far you've traveled without a map. By the time I understood that my inner life had crossed a threshold, I was already living differently, breathing differently, than the man I had once been so careful to maintain. What changed first was not how I dressed, or how I spoke, or how I moved through the world. What changed first was what I allowed myself to feel without immediately correcting it. For most of my life, feelings had been provisional. I experienced them quickly, efficiently, and then passed judgment. Was this useful? Appropriate? Productive? Anything that failed that internal review was quietly shelved. I had thought this was emotional discipline. I was beginning to understand it had been emotional avoidance disguised as responsibility. As I gave myself permission, real permission, not the kind that expires at dawn, to exist without constant self-policing, my emotions became more textured. Sadness lingered instead of being rushed into resolution. Joy arrived without the caveat that it must justify itself. Anxiety spoke more clearly when I stopped trying to drown it out with logic. Claire noticed this before I did. She said it one evening while we were washing dishes, the sound of running water filling the pauses between us. "You're more here," she said. I turned to her. "I was always here." She smiled, not unkindly. "You were present." "That's not the same thing." At first, I bristled. Then I listened. That had become my practice, resisting the urge to defend, letting statements settle before deciding what they meant. "I think," she continued, "you spent a long time living as if your inner life were something to manage. Now you're letting it participate." Participate. The word struck me as both gentle and radical. With that participation came discomfort. There were days when I missed the simplicity of ignorance, when the old structure, rigid, predictable, emotionally economical, tempted me with its familiarity. Growth, I was learning, doesn't feel like expansion from the inside. It feels like exposure. I began journaling, not with the intent to chronicle progress, but to slow myself down enough to hear my own thoughts without interruption. What emerged was not a tidy narrative of self-discovery, but a series of questions that refused to resolve neatly. What does it mean to be honest when honesty may unsettle people you love? At what point does discretion become denial? Is identity something you claim, or something you practice? These questions didn't demand immediate answers. They demanded patience, humility, and a willingness to live inside uncertainty without trying to conquer it. As my internal shifts deepened, the external world began to push back, not overtly, but through subtle frictions. A colleague joked about men these days, meaning nothing by it. I felt the comment land differently than it once would have. A family friend remarked approvingly on my dependability, and I wondered how much of that perception was built on my silence. None of this made me angry. It made me aware. Awareness, I discovered, is exhausting. You begin to see the scaffolding beneath everyday interactions, the assumptions, the shorthand, the unspoken agreements, and once seen, they cannot be unseen. I started noticing how often people perform their roles with the same dutiful rigidity I had once brought to mine. How many of us confuse endurance with virtue? I didn't want to become critical. I wanted to become compassionate. But compassion, real compassion, requires refusing to flatten complexity into judgment. One afternoon, Claire asked if I wanted to go shopping with her. Just errands. Nothing symbolic. I hesitated, then agreed. In the past, I would have treated this as a task, accompany, assist, exit. This time, I let myself be present. We moved through the store slowly. I noticed textures, colors, the way clothing was organized not just by size, but by expectation. The experience wasn't thrilling. It was clarifying. I understood, viscerally, how much of identity is shaped by what is offered and what is withheld, by what you are invited to imagine yourself inside. At one point, Claire held up a blouse and asked, casually, "What do you think?" I gave an honest answer, not because I was trying to signal anything, but because honesty felt less risky than silence now. That fabric would be comfortable, I said. But the cut might make someone feel like they're apologizing for their shoulders. She looked at me, surprised, then thoughtful. That's very specific. So are clothes, I replied. We shared a quiet smile. It was a small moment, but it carried weight. I wasn't observing from the outside anymore. I was participating in meaning. Later, at home, Claire asked if I wanted to try the blouse on. She asked without ceremony, without expectation. I said yes. Standing there, wearing it, I didn't feel transformed. I felt accurate. The mirror reflected someone I recognized, not because the image was novel, but because it wasn't distorted by effort. I wasn't trying to be anything. I was allowing. I noticed how my posture shifted when I stopped bracing. How my breath settled lower. How my expression softened when I wasn't monitoring it for compliance. I also noticed fear. Not of discovery, but of responsibility. If this was true, if this version of myself was more honest, then what did that demand of me? How would I integrate this understanding into the rest of my life without fragmenting it? How would I speak about it without reducing it to spectacle or misunderstanding? Claire sensed my tension. You don't have to solve this, she said. You just have to stay with it. Staying with it turned out to be the hardest part. There were moments when I wanted to retreat into familiar masculinity, not because it felt right, but because it felt legible. The world knew how to read me that way. I knew how to move through it without friction. But legibility, I was learning, is not the same as truth. It's just easier to navigate. The phrase "her girl" entered our vocabulary slowly, almost tentatively. It wasn't a declaration. It was a question disguised as language. Claire used it once, playfully, then waited. I felt the words settle inside me, testing their resonance. They didn't feel diminishing. They felt relational. Being her girl didn't mean surrendering agency or identity. It meant allowing myself to be known in a way that wasn't governed by dominance or distance. It reframed tenderness as strength, interdependence as maturity. Still, I resisted claiming it outright. Labels carry weight. They invite interpretation. I wanted to earn whatever language I used through lived integrity, not aspiration. As months passed, my sense of self grew quieter, not louder. I stopped rehearsing explanations in my head. I stopped imagining worst-case reactions to disclosures I hadn't made. I focused instead on coherence, making sure my actions aligned with my values, even when those values were still forming. This coherence began to show up in unexpected ways. I apologized more readily when I was wrong. I listened without planning my response. I allowed myself to be uncertain in conversations where certainty had once been my shield. People responded. Not always with understanding, but with curiosity. Some relationships deepened. A few grew strained. None collapsed catastrophically, which taught me something important. Fear often overestimates its own foresight. The most difficult reckoning was internal. Accepting that I had been complicit, actively or passively, in maintaining a version of myself that felt safer to others than it did to me. That reckoning wasn't about guilt. It was about accountability. I couldn't undo the past. But I could choose how honestly I inhabited the present. One night, lying beside Claire, I said, "I think I'm afraid that if I keep going, there will be no version of me that fits neatly anymore." She turned toward me. Maybe fitting neatly was never the goal. That stayed with me. What I was becoming was not an answer. It was a practice. A commitment to live without disowning parts of myself for the sake of comfort, mine or anyone else's. I didn't yet know how visible this life would become, or what costs visibility might demand. I only knew that retreating now would require a level of self-betrayal I was no longer willing to perform. And that, more than any garment or label, marked the real transformation. The moment visibility stopped being theoretical was the moment I understood that identity is not only something you feel, it is something other people respond to, often before you are ready. Up until then, my changes had lived mostly in private spaces or ambiguous ones. At home. In thought. In the subtle recalibration of how I carried myself. The outside world had been a background hum, present, but not yet demanding articulation. That illusion didn't shatter all at once. It thinned, quietly, until one ordinary interaction made it impossible to ignore. It happened at a cafe I frequented near work. I'd been going there for years, long enough to be recognized but not known. That morning, I ordered as usual, wearing nothing that announced anything overtly, just softer lines, gentler choices, the accumulated residue of months spent refusing to harden myself for legibility. The barista hesitated, looked at me again, then smiled uncertainly. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked, her tone polite but searching, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle she hadn't expected. "No, thank you," I said. She nodded, but her smile lingered a fraction too long. Not judgmental. Not curious in a cruel way. Just aware. I took my coffee and sat down, heart racing in a way that felt disproportionate to the moment. Nothing had happened. And yet, something had. I had been read, not correctly or incorrectly, just differently. And the world had adjusted, however slightly, in response. What startled me wasn't fear. It was grief. Grief for the simplicity of anonymity. For the ease of moving through spaces without being interpreted. I had spent years assuming that being unseen was neutral. I was beginning to understand it had been a privilege. When I told Claire about it that evening, I expected reassurance. Instead, she asked, "How did it feel to be noticed?" I thought about it. Exposing, I said. But also, real. She nodded. Both can be true. That became a refrain. Both can be true. Comfort and discomfort. Relief and fear. Integrity and consequence. I had spent so long treating these states as mutually exclusive that allowing them to coexist felt radical. With visibility came questions, not always asked aloud, but felt. Friends who looked at me a beat longer before speaking. Colleagues who recalibrated their tone, unsure which version of me they were addressing. None of it was hostile. That, in some ways, made it harder. Hostility would have been easier to categorize. Ambiguity requires patience. I found myself confronting a new ethical tension, how much to explain, and when. Disclosure can be an act of trust, but it can also become a burden, both for the person sharing and the person receiving. I didn't want my life to turn into a series of footnotes, clarifying myself for others' comfort. At the same time, I didn't want silence to calcify into deception again. The balance was delicate, and I didn't always get it right. The first intentional conversation I had outside my marriage was with a close friend, Mark, someone I'd known since college. We met for a walk, something we'd done countless times before. The familiarity was both grounding and terrifying. "I'm not entirely sure how to say this," I began, after several false starts. Mark shrugged. "You've never been concise. Go on." I laughed, grateful. Then I spoke, not in declarations, but in experiences. I talked about learning to listen to myself. About realizing how much of my life had been shaped by expectation rather than choice. I didn't offer labels. I didn't ask for validation. I just spoke honestly. When I finished, Mark was quiet for a long moment. I braced myself. "Okay," he said finally. "I don't fully understand. But I believe you." The simplicity of that response undid me more than any impassioned speech could have. Belief, I realized, is not the same as comprehension. It is an ethical stance, not an intellectual one. Not all conversations went that smoothly. Some were awkward. A few were disappointing. One or two revealed fault lines I hadn't known existed. I learned quickly that people's reactions often had less to do with me than with the stories they told themselves about stability, gender, and the meaning of change. I didn't try to correct those stories. I didn't have the energy. What I did have was a growing sense of self-respect, rooted not in certainty, but in alignment. At home, my relationship with Claire continued to deepen in unexpected ways. The more honest I became with myself, the more present I became with her. Our conversations grew richer, less transactional. We spoke openly about power, about care, about how roles can be chosen rather than inherited. Being a her girl, when we used the phrase, wasn't about hierarchy. It was about trust. About allowing myself to receive without shame. About redefining strength as responsiveness rather than control. This reframing extended beyond our relationship. I began noticing how often masculinity is taught as resistance, to vulnerability, to softness, to change. Letting go of that resistance didn't make me less capable. It made me more adaptable. Adaptability, I was learning, is an ethical skill. Public perception remained uneven. Some days, I moved through the world with a sense of quiet rightness. Other days, a single glance could unravel me. I learned to distinguish between discomfort that signaled danger and discomfort that signaled growth. The former demanded caution. The latter demanded courage. There were setbacks. Moments when fear reclaimed ground I thought I'd secured. Times when I chose invisibility out of exhaustion rather than discernment. I learned not to punish myself for those moments. Progress is not linear. Integrity is not brittle. The most challenging conversations were with myself, late at night, when the house was quiet and the future felt large and undefined. I asked questions I couldn't yet answer. How visible do I want to be? What does responsibility look like if my identity continues to evolve? How do I honor the life I've lived without being trapped by it? I didn't rush those questions. Rushing, I had learned, was how I used to avoid listening. What steadied me was the realization that my transformation was not a departure from my values, but a refinement of them. Honesty mattered more now, not less. Empathy had expanded, not diluted. Accountability had deepened, extending inward as well as outward. I wasn't asking the world to change for me. I was asking myself to stop pretending I hadn't changed. That distinction mattered. By the end of that year, I could no longer claim that my life was the same with a few private adjustments. It was different. Quieter in some ways. More complex in others. Less defensible, perhaps, but more true. I didn't know where this path would lead. I only knew that turning back would mean abandoning a self I had finally begun to treat with respect. And once you make that choice, to respect yourself, you become responsible for what follows. If visibility teaches you anything, it is that courage is not a single act but a series of recalibrations. Each day asked something slightly different of me, and I was rarely certain I was answering correctly. What I was certain of was that I could no longer measure my life by how little disruption it caused. The question had shifted. It was no longer how do I keep everything the same. It was what kind of disruption is worth enduring? I began to understand that much of my earlier restraint had been rooted in a desire to remain legible to others, to be easily categorized, easily trusted, easily excused from further scrutiny. There is comfort in being understood quickly. There is also a profound loneliness in being understood shallowly. As I grew more comfortable inhabiting ambiguity, I noticed how often people reached for certainty not because they needed it, but because they were afraid of what patience might reveal. Gender, I realized, functions socially as a shortcut. It tells people how to speak to you, what to expect from you, where to place you in their mental architecture of the world. When you loosen that signal, even slightly, you ask people to do more work. Some rose to the occasion. Others resented it. At work, the changes were subtle but persistent. I didn't announce anything. I simply stopped correcting assumptions that no longer fit and began correcting those that actively misrepresented me. When someone described me as unshakable, I said, calmly, I don't think that's accurate. I think I'm responsive. When a colleague praised my commanding presence, I thanked them but added, I value collaboration more than command. These weren't confessions. They were calibrations. Most people adjusted without comment. A few seemed unsettled, as if I had violated an unspoken contract. I learned quickly who depended on my old performance to stabilize their own sense of order. That knowledge was sobering, but it was also clarifying. Not all discomfort is something you're responsible for alleviating. The most consequential shift happened internally, in how I understood accountability. I had once believed accountability meant predictability, being reliable, consistent, unchanged. I was beginning to see it differently now. Accountability meant being answerable to the truth of my actions, even as that truth evolved. This redefinition forced me to confront a fear I had been circling for months, that my transformation, however gentle, might eventually ask more of my marriage than either of us could give. Claire and I spoke about this openly, not in crisis, but in care. We talked about futures without guarantees, about how love adapts, or doesn't, when the people inside it change. These conversations were not always reassuring. They were, however, honest. One night, she said, I don't love you because you stayed the same. I love you because you stay present. That distinction mattered more than I could articulate. Being a her girl had, by then, become less a phrase and more a practice. It meant trusting her with my vulnerability without outsourcing my agency. It meant allowing tenderness to be reciprocal rather than strategic. It meant recognizing that interdependence is not a failure of strength, but a refinement of it. I noticed how this orientation reshaped my interactions beyond our marriage. I asked for help more readily. I admitted uncertainty without embarrassment. I let myself be cared for in small ways I had once deflected with humor or dismissal. Each act felt minor. Together, they rewired something fundamental. I also became more aware of how others navigate similar tensions, often silently. Friends confided struggles they had never named before, about pressure, about expectation, about the cost of maintaining coherence at the expense of authenticity. I didn't position myself as an example. I simply listened. Listening, I had learned, is its own form of visibility. There were moments of grief still. Some relationships faded, not with conflict, but with quiet distance. Some opportunities narrowed as I became less willing to perform certainty on demand. I felt these losses acutely. Growth does not anesthetize you to consequence. If anything, it sharpens your awareness of it. But there were gains, too, subtle, profound gains that didn't announce themselves as victories. A deeper sleep. A steadier sense of self. The relief of no longer editing my inner life before allowing it to surface. I began to think less about what I was becoming and more about how I was living. The shift was liberating. Identity stopped feeling like a destination and started feeling like an ethic, a way of relating to myself and others with honesty, humility, and care. By the time I realized how far I had come, the question of whether this path was worth it no longer made sense. Worth is measured against alternatives. There was no viable alternative that didn't involve erasure. I was no longer trying to be understood by everyone. I was trying to be answerable to myself. That answerability carried a quiet strength. Not the kind that dominates a room, but the kind that endures scrutiny. The kind that can sit with uncertainty without demanding immediate resolution. The kind that allows change without collapsing into chaos. I didn't know how this story would end. I still don't. But I knew, with a clarity that surprised me, that whatever came next would be faced without the armor I had once mistaken for integrity. And that felt like enough. I used to think resolution was the reward for honesty. That if you told the truth long enough, clearly enough, the world would eventually hand you a stable ending, something you could point to and say, this is who I am now. What I learned instead is that honesty doesn't resolve you. It steadies you. By the time I reached what others might call acceptance, I had stopped chasing that word. Acceptance suggests arrival. What I felt was continuity, a sense that my life, once fragmented into roles and performances, had begun to speak in a single voice. Living as her girl was no longer something I tried on or negotiated internally. It had become an orientation. A way of standing in relation to care, to humility, to accountability. It didn't erase my past, it recontextualized it. I could look back at the man I had been, dutiful, guarded, sincere in his effort, and feel compassion rather than embarrassment. He had done the best he could with the tools he had. So was I. The most meaningful changes were almost invisible from the outside. I stopped flinching when people misunderstood me. I stopped explaining myself preemptively. I learned that clarity does not require consensus. It requires consistency between belief and action. There were still difficult moments. Public spaces that demanded quick categorization. Family gatherings where language lagged behind understanding. Occasional loneliness, the specific kind that comes from living truthfully in a world that prefers efficiency over nuance. But these moments no longer felt like threats. They felt like information. What surprised me most was how this life expanded my empathy outward. Once you stop insisting on your own certainty, you become gentler with other people's confusion. I no longer needed everyone to get it. I needed them to be human. That standard, it turns out, is both lower and harder to meet. I began mentoring quietly, listening more than advising, sharing experience only when asked. I resisted becoming a symbol. Symbols flatten people. I wanted to remain dimensional, even when that made me harder to summarize. Claire and I settled into something deeper than reassurance. Not a promise that nothing would change, but a trust that whatever did change would be faced together, without scripts. Love, I learned, is not the preservation of identity. It is the courage to let identity evolve without withdrawing care. The last lesson came slowly, and it came gently. I was no longer living in reaction to who I had been told to be. I was living in conversation with who I was becoming. That conversation is ongoing. It doesn't need an ending to be meaningful. If this story offers anything of value, I hope it is this: identity is not a spectacle, and it is not a betrayal. It is a responsibility. One that asks you to listen carefully, act thoughtfully, and remain accountable not just for how you appear, but for how you live. I trusted my wife, yes. But more than that, I learned to trust myself, not as an authority, but as a participant in my own life. And in doing so, I became someone I could stand beside without flinching. Not finished. Not perfect. But present. And finally, at peace with the fact that being seen, by myself, by those I love, is not the risk I once thought it was. It is the work.